I'm looking forward to this conversation about education. It's, we've been through an interesting year and a bit, to say the least. And I think it's nice to return to, if I say two areas of education that BCS cares about passionately. One which I describe as the outcomes piece, which is about the purposes of education, what we're actually trying to do with it. Are we trying to do the right things? Has the past year and a half called some of that into the question? Has it led us to believe that maybe there are things we're not doing enough about within our schools, colleges, universities, whatever, in terms of the demands that the world will now place with us? On the outcome side, just to do a little bit of BCS spiel before bringing people in, we start from the position that everybody needs, I could summarize it as the knowledge and skills to participate in the previous session for those that you were in it, to understand enough about technology, to be active citizens, to be actively within society, to shape society, to participate in society, and active within the economy. And at the same time as having an interest in the purposes and the outcomes of education, there's knowledge, skills, and whatever developed by the young people that come through it, we have an interest in the process of education itself, which we've seen massively change over the past year and a bit, sometimes adapting well, sometimes adapting perhaps not quite so well. And we're going to touch on both those things in the panel conversation. I'm going to start with Jim. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, Jim, if you would, and then to kick us off about, are we educating people in the right things? If we are, we can go home. If we're not, what are the things that we should be putting more focus on? Off you go, Jim.
Thank you, Neil. So yeah, my name is Jim Knight. I am otherwise known as Lord Knight of Weymouth. So I'm a recovering politician in the House of Lords. I've just also finished half a dozen years as one of the chief officers at TES, and I'm now back advising a range of different people about different things. But attending, my sweet spot is around learning and technology and the interplay between the two. Are we learning the right things? No, is the very short answer. We are really tightly focused and tightly controlled in, up to 16, where we have a national curriculum on knowledge, and in particular academic knowledge. So it's therefore a focus almost exclusively on cognitive development, with a neglect, therefore, of social, emotional, and physical development. And I very strongly feel that the current school system is not fit for purpose because it is failing to develop those more rounded skills. And it's also, incidentally, failing to develop the application of knowledge. We talk about STEM, Neil, and within science, technology, engineering, and maths, the two more applied subjects of technology and engineering are neglected in the diet of most young people's school experience. And STEM just becomes S&M. And that's, I think, a strange cruelty to inflict on our young people when they could get so much more enrichment out of applying their learning.
That's great. Kat, any views on what Jim's just said?
I'm probably not going to entirely agree with Jim, but that's what you want on a discussion like this, isn't it?
Absolutely right.
Viewpoints. So yeah, luckily the joy of not being face to face is we can't end up in a fist fight over this. Yeah, so I do take some of Jim's point, but I think one of the things that we need to be careful about kind of separating out is the idea that if something isn't sort of on the curriculum, it's not a curriculum subject, that means that we're not focusing on it or developing it. I don't know a single teacher that would say that a student leaving with the kind of social skills that Jim talked about, with the ability to collaborate effectively, to think critically, I think every teacher would say that those things are important. I think actually where the debate exists more is in how we develop those, where some people would argue, we should have more time specifically within the curriculum dedicated to developing those sorts of what are often called sort of 21st century skills or soft skills. Whereas I think there's another sort of strong line of argument that really those are developed through and within and across the sort of academic subjects, creative subjects, things that are already within the curriculum. People like Daniel Willingham, for example, would argue that you can't think critically about something if you don't have knowledge of it, and that actually things like critical thinking are and problem solving are sort of domain specific. Problem solving in maths doesn't look the same as problem solving in other subjects, for example. And so we need to be teaching those within the context of for example, an academic subject. And I think that there's a sort of strong argument for that, because there's a risk otherwise that something is lost, and we try to teach these kind of skills in the abstract, but it's almost the opposite of the problem that you described, Jim. And I think we have this pendulum swing that you're right, that sometimes we focus on knowledge too much and don't think about application of that, but there's an equal risk going the other way and focusing on skills and don't think of the application of those in the context of knowledge. And I think it's very easy kind of and tempting politically and educationally to see a kind of pendulum swing between those, and we over focus on skills and then we over focus on knowledge. But I would argue very much from the sort of teaching perspective that teachers do understand the value of these things, that I would hesitate to say that they're not being developed, that children aren't leaving school with these. I think teachers put a real focus on that. Maybe how they're recognised is an area of kind of gap, but I think that they are considered to be important from my perspective.
And I agree with a lot of that. Sorry, Neil, but we're going to have.
Oh, yeah,
we'll do a bit of that. And I really don't want to be part of a skills versus knowledge thing. I don't think that's helpful to anything, because they're both really important. But this morning I spent an hour and a half with the deputy heads of Somerset, and in terms of what's happened in the last period, what do you want to keep? None of them mentioned tutoring. None of them mentioned the Oak National Academy, but they did mention forest schooling, and they did mention doubling the length of break time and being mindful about what you got out of break, because that meant that kids were more focused when they came back. And so that means it's true. Teachers do care about these things, and they're doing some of those things, and they loved the carrot of autonomy that was waved at them during the first lockdown, and trusting them as professionals to be able to do those things. And in a way, I'm kind of saying, I later had a conversation with a guy called Timo Hane as part of another event, talking about data and data collection. And the policymakers that he talks to a lot, they're obsessed about attainment data, but they're not that fussed about the well-being data, and they're not fussed about some of the other rounded measures of how children are developing, which teachers do value. And that's my regret, is that the incentives in the system are pretty narrowly in one place, and we need to trust teachers more and give them more autonomy, and then that will broaden things to the benefit of children.
Okay, so can I bring you both down? I'll go to you first, Kat, on this. In terms of what this means for digital technology, in terms of what this means for young people's experience learning through, for, with, and about digital technology, are there specific things that we need to take away from the slight disagreement, but disagreement about the same things, if I can describe it like that? Because I think you're on the same diagram. I think you're just weighting different parts of the diagram differently. But if I can ask you, Kat, and by the way, you haven't introduced yourself.
It
would be great if you did. If I could ask you to say a little bit about what you think any of this means for how we, the outcomes we need from young people in terms of digital technology, computing, their understanding of the technology that's shaping the world, and how schools, use the power of that technology to better deliver on outcomes for young people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally with Jim. Now we're absolutely aligned with trust teachers, professional teacher autonomy, all over that. Yes, so I'm Kat Scutt. I'm Director of Education and Research at the Chartered College of Teaching, which is the professional body for teachers. So you'll probably hear me defending teachers throughout. But yeah, I think it's a fascinating question when we think about what is it exactly that students need to learn about technology and with technology. I think one of the the kind of traps we sometimes fall into when talking about education, IT, computing is going down too much of a kind of functional preparing students for future careers kind of rhetoric, because we know that there is a skills gap in terms of people filling technology focused roles. It can be very tempting to say, we need to do computing, we need more people to do computing and digital subjects because there's all these jobs out there that need to be filled. But I think there's a risk in kind of being a bit too narrow when we take that view on it, and that we start to then think about the subjects and learning in terms of their kind of future utility rather than actually all of the things that Jim was talking about. So richness and curiosity and depth and intellectual challenge, learning about the world, exactly as you said, learning about kind of society, what technology means for society, our whole understanding of the way in which the world functions, what it means to be a citizen in a kind of digital age. I think we have to make sure that we're thinking about it as being kind of valuable in its own right, that studying computing, for example, should be an intellectually enriching and meaningful experience, whether you are planning to go on to work in computing or whether you want to go on and become an artist or teach English or anything else. That actually it's got to be seen as something that is worthy of learning in its own right, as education should be seen as something that's worthy in its own right, not just about preparing students for future jobs.
Thanks, Kat. And that's actually led us into a question from Andy, which I won't read the whole question out. But basically, the bit towards the end, which we're starting to get towards, Kat, is the role of, IT, computing, digital within other areas of the curriculum. If we are talking about people as capable participants who are learning, who are doing a whole range of other things, and technology is part of their lives, what about the implications? Are there implications for other parts of the curriculum than that small box called computing within a bigger box called STEM? What about history? What about geography? What about English? What about PSHE? What about music? Jim, are you happy to pick that up?
I am. It's a great challenge, Andy, and in a way, it worryingly sort of drags me back into the extent to which digital and computing relates to skills and how much it's an academic subject in its own right, and it's kind of both. I would really like to see data analysis being something that's much more of a fundamental skill, because it's quite fundamental to the social sciences for sure. What we used to call statistics, and the two are obviously, I think, highly related in terms of data analysis and statistics. But making sense of data and being confident about how we manipulate and make sense of data is a part of what I think of as computer science. And it's a sort of core skill. And even at a basic level, talking to primary heads today, they are really welcoming that they now have enough devices to embed computing into the use of computers into the way that they teach and learn. Thanks, as a legacy to the government spending in response to the pandemic. They're conscious that they have to teach handwriting, and they would like to be able to also teach typing and mouse and probably dictation as voice becomes a bigger interface. So there's some sort of skills that are kind of related to computing, and definitely digital skills, that I think we need across the curriculum. And I'd love us to use some of those things for examination. Examinations, when you get to 16 and 18, aren't necessarily with a paper and a pen on a tiny desk in a large sports hall. I think we can progress, and that's without then wanting to intrude on the importance of computing and computational thinking and how we develop that within a subject in its own right.
Great, thanks, Jim. Kat?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that Jim talks about it there is actually we do need to be quite distinct about the nature of computing as a sort of specific subject discipline, which should be valued as such, but also the digital skills that are needed across the curriculum. I think this really, just the fact that we call it digital literacy quite often is quite helpful, because if you start to think about it as a parallel for example, literacy and then the study of English and English literature, that becomes quite helpful, because there's the kind of functional element of it that is needed across all of these different subjects. There are very specific skills that are needed in different subject areas that make use of technology, but then there is also this subject as its own discipline. And I think that that's a really helpful distinction to make. We've been doing some work recently, doing a literature review looking at teachers' digital skills. And one of the things that came out of that was really interesting was when you look at the kind of digital competence frameworks around the world for teachers, there's lots of them, and they have lots of very sensible things in them about what teachers should know. But there's a real gap in terms of actually teachers knowing how to develop pupils' digital skills as a specific element of that. There's almost an assumption that there's kind of, if the teachers have digital skills and we want the pupils to develop digital skills too, those things will sort of magically happen. But there seems to actually be a very sort of specific skill set in understanding how do you develop pupils' digital skills beyond the kind of computing curriculum area. And it's certainly, you know, there was a point when probably very naively some people thought, oh, well, we don't need to, because actually the kids are better with computers than the teachers are half the time. But we know that doesn't translate to actually being able to use technology productively for learning, for example, knowing just simple things like how reading on screen is different. We read on screen in a different way to how we read in print. When we note take digitally, we do it in a different way to when we note take by hand, and this can really affect how we remember and process and understand what we're doing. And there are things that we need students to understand like this. So there's a real piece there, I think, to recognise the role that teachers can play in that, and how that is a distinct element of teachers' digital competence, being able to support the development of pupils' digital competence.
Yeah, I mean, the role of teachers and the importance of teachers getting all this. I often think that the fact that we mediate so much of teaching through language, through particular sorts of things, has become invisible to teachers. So they don't realise how good they are at it. And because they don't realise how good they are at it, they don't realise how not good they are at other ways of supporting learning, because some things feel naturally in the way the world is, and some things feel quite different.
And Neil, one other thing that I should have mentioned, but it sort of relates to this. You know, if we trusted teachers and treated them like professionals more in subjects like English, the evolution of, and the way the world works outside us, English and citizenship would be thinking much more about media literacy right now. They'd be less bogged down by having to cover all the set texts that are prescribed, and they would be going, well, but it's equally important that we take into account of what people are reading, and they're reading a lot of stuff online using technology. And part of digital literacy is a media literacy around misinformation, disinformation, being able to differentiate truth from lies online, et cetera, which are all really important skills, kind of covered perhaps in PSHE, citizenship, but it's all a bit vague. But that's because we have a system where we're just told what we're supposed to teach according to a silo, and that silo is reflected in a timetable. What if we trusted teachers to sort of work some of this stuff out?
A good challenge. I'm going to go to one of the questions that's come in, and we're going to go back to you, Jim, on this first stuff, because you and I have got previous in this.
Yeah.
About the actual access barriers for people in disadvantaged households. I mean, is there something we need to sort out there first if we're really going to build on the opportunity?
Yeah, and Kim's question is a really good one. And, there was a brilliant speech by the previous Secretary of State for Education, Estelle Morris, in the House of Lords on Thursday, if people want to watch it back on Parliament Live TV. And where she talked about, what we've seen reinforced is a problem that's been there for generations to do with poverty. If you're unlucky enough to be born into poverty, you're more likely to be unhealthy. If you're unhealthy, you're more likely to struggle at school. If you struggle at school, you're more likely to miss the opportunities that society offers you. And then within poverty is now digital poverty. And we know from the statistics and the data that's been collected that I think 23% of children struggled to access the learning online because of access to devices. And that's a profound unfairness. And then their families more widely, if you want to get to apply for a job and get a job these days, most of them require you to be able to apply online. If you want to access benefit, you've got to be able to access that online. And so the problem of digital exclusion is now even more profound as a result of the pandemic because of the widespread adoption of technology. And so we're now at a point where, actually the number of families that have no internet access is now really small. It's down to a few percentages. The reason why that expands to all those number of children are things like families having to choose between data and food, some really profound, difficult choices, which some telecoms companies were able to alleviate somewhat during the pandemic, I know. But then, have they got multiple devices? Is the only device a mobile phone? In too many cases in poor families, that's the case. Can you really do your learning using a mobile phone? And if there's only one of them, which of the kids is going to have access to that? There's a range, there's a series of issues that we've still got to resolve. But capitalizing on the sort of step change in where we are on the adoption curve in terms of the use of technology generally, to be able to make the case more powerfully that those that are excluded are now even more disadvantaged, so let's fix it.
Thanks, Jim. So I'm going to go over to Kat. If we do fix it, then that means that, and we get to a point where every learner we can take it for granted that every learner has access to learning through technology. What are the implications for teachers, Kat, and for schools in general?
So I think there's another layer that we need to think of on top of just the device access. There's no doubt, as Jim said, it's a huge issue, and it's both been exacerbated by the pandemic, but also demonstrated much more clearly by the pandemic. I think we've all known kind of in schools for years that there's a real disparity in terms of access to devices and the internet. But of course, we see that really, really bluntly in a situation like this. But the other thing that comes out is not just just providing the devices and even the connectivity is not enough. It's then having a quiet space where you can sit and engage in that learning. It's having perhaps the digital skills that we've already talked about, having the parental digital skills to be able to use those devices effectively for learning. So there's a whole layer of things that we have to assume exist alongside those, but assuming in our magical utopia we have all of those things in place as well. I think for me the pandemic's done something quite interesting in seeing how what the role of teachers is and what the real value of teachers is. I think that previously there was quite a lot of kind of evangelism about kids can just learn online now. You can learn anything online. What are schools for? What do we need teachers for? But actually, I think what we've really seen is how much is lost when you don't have that kind of human whether face-to-face or remote, but live contact and engagement with a real human being teacher, that actually just learning from pre-prepared videos and courses and things like that is not the same as having a relationship with an expert teacher who knows you, who knows their subject, who knows how best to understand the misconceptions you have and move you forward. So I think that's demonstrated for me, and I think for a lot of others, that we're oversimplistic when we think about this kind of model where everything can just be learned online and what are teachers for. The value of teachers has been so obvious. I think there's something interesting that comes in there though, that kind of touches back on Kim's question from the other side. The other thing that we have seen is that where some people have been saying, I can't wait till we can go back to the theatre in real life again. You've seen this other band of people who, for whatever reason, weren't able to go to the theatre before, and suddenly they've got access to these amazing opportunities. And this is true of learning as well, of course, that they didn't have access to before. This has been fascinating from a teacher CPD perspective as well. I live in Cornwall. I know that teachers in Cornwall just do not have the access to the range of CPD opportunities that teachers in London do, for example, in normal times. But when everything's gone online, suddenly there's a much greater equity of access. So there's a kind of, on the one side, there's the loss of access and the kind of barriers that mean that we're excluding one group of people. But on the other hand, actually, there are things that using technology does that embraces and brings in a whole other group. So I think recognizing that and understanding how we balance that and give everyone this amazing access is really, really crucial.
Jim, any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that pedagogically, really obviously, because I hadn't been trained any differently, most teachers, when they were presented with these devices that they suddenly had to be competent with and platforms that they had to be competent with, tried as best they could to replicate the pedagogies that they knew online, the face-to-face pedagogies. And and they did a heroic job, but that's never going to be as good as using the same pedagogies face to face. However, there are pedagogies, and people like Dan and Lorillard have done some great research around all of that, that you can make work very well online as long as it's interactive. And the work of, I don't want to be obsessed by them, the Oak National Academy was heroic in terms of creating what they did so quickly and rolling that out, and it's been used by lots of teachers and still is, but it's not interactive. It is broadcasting teaching. And then you've got to then find other ways of using it interactively. Whereas using online pedagogies interactively can create a really quality experience. And then especially if it's then blended with face-to-face, a really good blend. And I just think we're at the foothills of knowing how to do this in terms of teaching. But we will work this out, and it's a really exciting opportunity, because it's an opportunity to do things that are just previously inconceivable. And all power to the teaching profession to get on with it. And I hope that they're properly resourced with the professional development, which I would also hope is going to be delivered in a blended fashion, to be able to access that openly, even from Cornwall.
Yeah, I think this is part of an issue that's not just in education, it's everywhere. How do you make sure, and it's part of the AI debate, isn't it? How do you make sure you've got human beings doing the things that human beings are uniquely placed to do and can do pretty well? And how do you make sure you've got technology doing the things that technology can do pretty well and is uniquely placed to do? And perhaps even more importantly, how do you weave the two together so that the human beings who are involved in all of this can work effectively with the technology?
Yeah, and how we saw it with taxi drivers being de-skilled by algorithms put in the hands of Uber drivers. We're seeing it with the logistics workers being de-skilled by algorithms, who ultimately are replaceable by robots the more that their tasks are tightly managed by the software of people management. We don't want to go down the same road with teaching. If in the end what we value becomes the recall of knowledge as opposed to thinking about knowledge, then those learners will be replaced by robots, but their teachers will also be replaced by robots, because if all you're wanting to do is just transfer a bunch of knowledge, there are some real dangers that we'll work out more and more how to get machines to do that better and better, as opposed to a proper human interaction, which is about really developing the humanity of the learner, so that then the learner will never be outcompeted by a machine.
Okay, let's. I'm getting a sense of a kind of violent agreement here. There's perhaps some bits around the edges where kind of thing, and a lot of it will be about balance. It's easy for me to say, find the things that human beings are good at, find the things that technology are good at, and find our ways of bringing them together productively. But that will be a big debate, won't it? I mean, I think we're working that through. I want to move us on in the last part of this. And then I'll pick up on the couple of questions that are there. Who do we need to carry with us in this discussion? Teachers, I take for granted, but who else do we need to take with us? And then I'm going to go to the two questions, one from Leroy and one from Andy. But let's start with you, Kat. Who do we need to engage in this conversation? Perhaps with your chartered college hat on, thinking through how we engage the profession and the stakeholders around the profession. But who else do we need to involve in this conversation?
I mean, ultimately, everyone is a very simple answer to that, but it's the reality, isn't it? That actually it's all of the stakeholders of schools. It's the students themselves, certainly, but it's the parents. It's the tech companies. Jim already made reference to the fact that during the pandemic, a number of mobile data providers whitelisted key sites to mean that data wasn't an issue in terms of students accessing. That's huge, and of course that's something that should be in place. But ultimately, this is also reliant very much on government and government policy driving this. And they are then again driven, of course, by the voters. So you've got this kind of really it does have to be a sort of team effort, so to speak, because you need to have the teachers understanding. I think actually we're much further forwards with that as well. I mentioned that obviously the kind of some of the evangelists realize what's lost with tech, but equally those who are maybe the tech skeptics have definitely seen that actually sometimes there's been no other option, but that actually there are things that work really well. So I think we're in a much better place now in terms of recognizing how we can use digital better in teaching and learning from a teaching perspective. So absolutely, the teachers, school leaders, policymakers, school governors. I saw we've got a parent governor here. Great. It's got to be a kind of a united and consistent effort in the same direction if we want to see this really as a sort of nationwide reality rather than sort of pockets of practice.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to pick up on Andy's question. Well, this isn't a question, it's an observation which strikes me. As the parent of a 16-year-old watching him in his bedroom on the receipt of what first off felt like the early days of cinema, when someone purely pointed a camera at an actor and tried to, this is following your point, Jim, just tried to recreate something that would work in the classroom, but just simply didn't work, doing presentations at people. And I watched, 10 years evolution happen rather quickly, but not to the point that I think Andy's making, where we've got some highly skilled young people out there who know how to develop this content, and they're sat on the receiving end from people who, to be honest, why should they know? So any thoughts on that from either of you? And then Brian's going to come in and tell us we've had our time, I think, quite soon.
Well, I would quickly say, I'm currently on a Lord's Select Committee looking at sport and recreation, and we've got a debate about esports, things like FIFA and so on, whether they're our friend because they're sport, or whether they're our enemy because they're sedentary. And I asked a former international rugby player about this, and he said in one of our evidence sessions, he said, look, we have to learn from how engaging those games are and make our experience as engaging as that. And it's exactly the same response that I have to Andy. Let's be inspired by what is engaging young people and what they're creating, and step up to that, and keep evolving our experience. The gamification of learning is a whole other debate that we can have, but I've got no doubt in my mind that there are things that we can learn from that to make learning more fun, more engaging, and to open up access to subjects that currently people have got a mental block about.
Okay, and I'll come to you, Kat, with Leroy's about online presence for young people. Is that part of a sort of global, if I can call it like that, education provision would look like?
Yeah, I think that really comes back to what we were talking about just before, about this idea that actually if we want that to happen, it's got to be a kind of move from everyone, because it requires, it requires the devices, it requires the spaces, the digital skills, it requires, teachers to have those skills. I think it links in also to Andy's point around more interactive communities that you see on YouTube, for example. And there's one of the things that this again comes to the kind of digital pedagogies point. There are many pupils who actually feel much more confident sort of typing and sharing an answer in a Zoom chat than they do putting their hand up and sharing that in class. You can also get a response from a lot more people at the same time than if you're going around one at a time in the class. So that's an example of where actually technology is really powerful and more inclusive. And I think that actually, again, this brings it back nicely around to Jim's point, because I think what Jim says is exactly right, that sometimes it's easy to say, oh, well, if these things are so popular, if these games are so popular, let's use them in education. This is actually what I looked at in my master's. Is it a great idea to use more games in education? Minecraft didn't exist then, but it would have been, should we use Minecraft in the class? Actually, it's exactly the opposite. What we need to recognize is that what's powerful about games actually is often that they're really good learning experiences. That's what you're doing when you're getting better at a game, you're progressing, you're getting feedback all the time about what's working and what's not working. You're having things provided that are just a little bit harder than what you're able to do right now. So you're constantly progressing. And those are the sorts of things that we know are really effective learning experiences. So it's more about thinking about actually what are the high quality features of learning that we need to see in the classroom that are already being utilized in games, rather than the simple response of, let's bring games into the classroom, which, you know, might have its place. I got to spend a fascinating day at a school in Norway once that has esports as one of its equivalent to A-level options, and a very dark room of students sitting playing World of Warcraft or some such, being taught by some hugely rich World of Warcraft champion player. A whole different world, fascinating. But yeah, I absolutely agree with Jim's point there. So yeah, great.
Thank you. I'm going to thank both our speakers, Jim and Kat. I'm going to just make my own observation on Leroy's observation about the importance of not excluding special educational needs pupils. To be honest, we wouldn't have invited Kat or Jim onto the panel if we couldn't have taken it for granted that they would have just agreed with that. That has to be a given. We are talking about all young people in that, and that's part of our mission.